He doubled over on the porch as the canyon night threw back the strangest sound he had ever known. Laughter rolled out of him like something finally unchained, raw and breathless, while the stars listened without judgment. Luna's squeal cracked the silence, slicing through the red rock basin as if the desert itself were a resonating chamber. The sound was ridiculous and transcendent, a wild note that found the hollow places inside and rang them clean. The tea cooled on the rail, the wind-braided juniper scent around the steps. Every rib in his chest hurt from the force of release, but he could not stop, not now that the desert accepted it. In the darkness beside his boots, a small weight pressed closer, purring like machinery buried under fur and heat. The canyons held the echo. The echo held his heart. Something old finally loosened. Silence returned sharp and electric, the kind that exposes seams in a life and asks what has been hiding there. He felt it in the humid imprint of his palms, in the tremor that lingered along his jaw, in the hard thud of a pulse not used to being heard. Then the second squeal rose, brighter and more precise, almost teasing, and the porch boards seemed to buzz with it. The noise found the cliff faces and ricocheted back, a playful threat masquerading as music. He tasted desert dust in the metal memory of long corridors he had abandoned. The night held breath. Crickets hesitated. Coyotes thought better of their routes, and a bat zigged away from some invisible line. The small body beside him shifted, claiming the hollow behind his heel, machine purr steady. He understood the trap and the sweetness. He also understood he wanted the trap.
Moonlight washed a shape that rattled like it carried a storm. The crate scraped the truck bed, wire-tired and rusted, the kind of wrong that speaks even before the smell of fear. Tyler's knuckles stayed too white on release, steps already retreating down gravel that shifted like marbles under boots. The handle bit skin when he lifted. Something inside hurled its weight against metal and expectation, scraping, slamming, shredding the night with a sound that did not fit a body so small. The canyon answered in hollow drums. He felt the old reflex in his shoulders, the clinical calm he used to wear like armor. But out here, the armor had seams. Wind carried sage and a faint copper taste. The latch shook beneath his thumb. For an absurd second, he imagined a voice that belonged to nothing with whiskers. The desert asked for nerve. He gave it. The lock turned with reluctant grit, and the door sprang a fraction before his hand truly meant it. The creature inside erupted, not outward in violence, but upward in voice, a pressure wave of raw survival that struck him in the teeth and eyes. Fur looked wrong where skin should have held it. Bone flickered under patchwork coat. The pupils were lantern dark and a face too delicate for the outrage it carried. He steadied uselessly against air as the squeal held and dipped, a siren that learned humor on its climb. The smell was old metal and hunger. He made space with his body, but the sound made space first, pushing everything gentler out of the way. The hills sent the noise back like a warning to themselves. He felt ridiculous for expecting gratitude. He felt ridiculous for feeling anything at all. He shut nothing. He chose to listen.
Years later, and only hours later, the same porch framed him with a cup steaming in clean night air. Balance returned in rituals learned from silence. Breathe with the cicadas. Count constellations he barely remembered. Let heat leave tired hands. The chirp landed behind him like a fingertip tapping the base of his spine. He flinched, wrists twisting, tea skimming the cup's rim and sliding down in a thin brown arc. The sound was small but exact, a needle finding a record groove. Stars sharpened as if focus were sound-dependent. The night grinned and waited. Footsteps soft as paintbrush strokes crossed boards. A whisker ticked his ankle. The purr resumed, casual as a program already running. He allowed the mistake, the spill, the startle,
because startle meant something alive had chosen proximity. His breath resynced with the machine hum beside him. Stillness became more complicated, which felt correct. Sleep did not hold. Walls, supposedly thick enough to tame wind, behaved like drums when the voice inside the clinic ricocheted off steel and chart drawers. He counted breaths as if calculation could outpace volume. The shrieks arrived in volleys, not random, almost strategic, as though the small creature were mapping weak points in his patience and the building's skeleton. The desert heard and did not intervene. He remembered the sterile hum of machines in a different life, lights that never dimmed, grief he kept in closets labeled professionalism. Out here, nothing absorbed the sound. It went through, and it stamped itself on bone. He poured water he did not drink. He paced grooves into a rug that did not deserve them. Toward dawn, silence teased, thin as thread, and then another blast of insistence made the thread snap. He thought of leaving the room. He did not.
He watched the body slam the cage edge with theatrical precision, not in true collision, but in a ritual of effect. The scream bled into a plaintive moan, collapsed to a coo, shifted into a broken music that belonged to nothing domestic. The act contained intelligence and a terrible sincerity. It asked for something without negotiating terms. The eyes tracked him between clipboard and sink. Paws slipped, regained, presented suffering as craft. He recognized showmanship and desperation woven so tightly they could not be separated. The desert beyond the window wore equal parts witness and judge. He felt the old itch to label, to categorize, to stack symptoms into diagnosis. Nothing about this wanted a label. It wanted a response. He turned away to buy himself a notion of control. She increased volume and invented new syllables to occupy the sudden gap. Control admitted defeat and learned listening. The day shaped into routine that did not deserve the name. He lifted, he checked, he recorded, he disinfected, he missed a step that mattered, and the instrument became a conduit. The trill came straight through tubing, concentrated like sunlight through glass, and detonated inside his ear with comic violence. The chair bucked under him because his body decided it did not care for dignity. Papers erupted as though delight had physical weight. The small shape pranced in the debris, tail a metronome beating smug rhythm. His hearing returned as a warm fizz. He tasted laughter just behind restraint and let none of it out. The clinic smelled of isopropyl, dust, and a stubborn feline opinion. He made a new mental note that was less medical and more tactical. Nothing in training had prepared him for instruments becoming prank venues. He stored the lesson. She stored his reaction.
Margin after margin filled with shorthand not meant for any official file. Chirp, likely manipulation. Gurgle, demands snack. Squeal, calibrated for maximum effect. Trill equals smugness. The act of writing did not control her. It clarified him. Structuring chaos became a way to sit in a room that otherwise felt like weather. He tested the sounds against time of day and the rise and fall of hunger. He refused the word tame and also refused the word wild because neither accounted for the humor in her gambits. There was absurdity here, edged like obsidian. He let it cut. Nights registered in graphite grooves across cheap paper. Days tilted toward participation. He noticed how the voice softened when he returned and sharpened when he attempted invisibility. The list grew into a lexicon. The lexicon became biography. The biography thickened into an understanding he pretended not to notice. Routine bent again when the faucet hissed and the basin flashed with quick movement. Paws planted where sterile instruments had once shone. Whiskers dripping theatrical diamonds. Eyes declaring that running water existed for audience engagement. Files lost their claim to surfaces as small shoulders asserted ownership of height and vantage. He made pathways with elbows and learned to set anything breakable far from arcs of leap and landing. The sound design of the room transformed. Gurgles punctuated the clink of metal. Trills layered over the rustle of paper. That machine purr threaded it all like a bass line. He could have moved her. He did not. He said nothing, because saying nothing turned into agreement, and agreement turned into shared ritual. The basin became fountain, stage, mirror, and confessional. He watched control erode with a strange relief, the way floodwater sometimes cleans more than it destroys.
The zipper whispered betrayal before he even turned. A paw learned the geometry of human closures and defeated it with patient mischief. Foil crinkled like a victory parade. Crumbs sealed the treaty. The trill that followed carried triumphant brass. No apology, no hesitation, only the simple assertion that boundaries could be redrawn if one party refused to acknowledge them. He chased nothing. He measured the place where frustration should be and found amusements settling in like dust. The clinic windows held afternoon light in a way that made everything look less dangerous. He forgot that danger often enjoys bright rooms. The small thief supervised cleanup from a high perch, purr throttled to a setting that implied satisfaction. He considered relabeling the lexicon to include audacity. The page gained a new entry. The body beside him gained calories and confidence. The line between patient and partner shifted invisibly. The knock arrived without warning and rearranged the air so fast that dust motes reconsidered their paths. He opened to mirrored lenses and a clipboard that bent posture into regulation. The room, suddenly too full of eyes, shrank even as the window showed an endless country that cared little for signatures. Questions arrived in measured tones. Measurements arrived in careful taps along wire and lock. The word compliance appeared like a cloud over summer rock. He felt his spine become a tool he did not want to use. The small body watched from a perch with velvet contempt and a theatrical not quite yawn. The purr cut, replaced by a humming neutrality that might either charm or indict, depending on audience. He witnessed his own heartbeat speed for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. The clipboard nodded like an executioner practicing mercy. The door closed slower than it had opened.
She descended with precision, brushed along a shin that needed grounding, and then held the officer in a beautiful cold assessment that read like a thesis on ownership. The room's temperature shifted. Authority found itself allergic to cats and unsure why. Her sweetness performed on one channel while dominance broadcast on another, and both signals interfered with the tidy script of inspection. He stood between them, body language pretending neutrality, while the part him that counted outcomes clenched into arithmetic. The checklist clicked onward with the confidence of bureaucratic machinery, yet the space felt less subject to it with every soft-footed pass. He understood, with reluctant clarity, that what bound them now would not fit any line on any form. The door latched. The canyon breathed. A desert fly traced a lazy figure 8 through sunlight and found nothing worth landing on. He still could not unclench. Lightning flattened the room into strips of white and shadow, each flash cutting time into pieces that felt sharper than seconds. The scream began as complaint and grew into a call that sounded like it wanted the roof removed. Wind rolled the junipers until they confessed their fragility. The metal sheltering the outdoor enclosure talked in a jitter of screws and brief threats. He paced a line that had already worn itself into the floor, calculating risk and telling himself that boundaries mean care, that care sometimes means waiting. Waiting did not suit the sound. Waiting did not suit his ribs. When he opened the door, the scream fell into a purr so quickly it looked like sleight of hand. Rain carried dust smell through the gap and pooled at his toes. The floor became a map of paw prints and decisions he would not rescind when the sky cleared.
Sunlight found the room in narrow ladders, laying stripes across sheets and shoulders. The small body weighed more than memory permitted and used that weight like a declaration, planting itself where breath happens, where the first thought of the day forms. Eyes met in the soft light, unblinking, patient as aircraft warning lights on distant towers. The purr re-engaged at a frequency calibrated to erase hesitations. Outside, the storm had rewired the desert so that scents rose brighter and the silence had a silver rim. Inside, space recalibrated around the geometry of a curled spine pressing into sternum and heartbeat. He traced history with the edge of his mind and realized that most of his rules had no anchors here. The ledger of strange languages did not include this moment because this moment needed no translation. Ownership complicated ethics and simplified mornings. He accepted both consequences without ceremony. The fawn arrived with panic singing in arterial bursts, room musk spiking with copper and antiseptic. She took the perimeter like a guard built from shadows and threat displays, tail inflated to foolish grandeur that did nothing to diminish the impact. Every step he made toward the injured pulled a low warning from her throat. Not hostility toward him exactly, but an unarguable statement about who this space belonged to. He knelt anyway, hands practiced, movements narrowed to efficiency. She kept orbit and commentary, a planet asserting gravity around a smaller, damaged moon. When the fawn sighed into exhaustion, she collapsed too, but in comedic theatrics, flopping with a dramatic whimper that translated as attention reclaimed. The room exhaled unevenly. He felt absurdly grateful for every contradiction, because contradiction meant choice, and choice meant life here was not governed solely by pain or regulation.
Between injections, charting, and recalculations of weight and dosage, the furred body went limp into a posture of exaggerated helplessness, belly up, paws suspended like punctuation marks that dared him not to respond. The sound that accompanied the pose borrowed from kittenhood and manipulation equally, a ribbon-wrapped plea that contained an iron core. He understood the trick and admired the craftsmanship. The desk corner dug into his thigh while he crouched to the gravity she manufactured. The room narrowed to fur texture, breath cadence, the faint tick of claws against wood when satisfaction synced with heartbeat. Outside, sun skirled across rock and bright ribbons. Inside, he renegotiated duty with devotion and called it something else to protect his pride. The fawn slept. The air settled. His choices multiplied in the thick quiet, each pathway framed by a purr that sounded like inevitability made real. A digital window opened to distant hills and a face on a screen waiting for expertise. The first sound on the call did not belong to him. The first image was a pair of tufted ears and curious eyes sliding into frame like a comedian stealing applause. The reaction on the other side shifted from professional neutrality to startled marvel and a little fear. Even pixels could not mute the absurd authority of that chirp. He felt heat rise in a place that used to stay cool for the sake of dignity. The canyon behind the camera refused to apologize for the intrusion. Protocols floated like paper boats in floodwater and sank without fanfare. The purr vibrated the desk, the pen, the bones in his wrist. He finished the call with fewer answers and a thicker sense that his clinic had become a stage, audience optional, performance guaranteed.
Patterns once used to calm badly injured minds dissolved under the razoring persistence of a creature who accepted nothing as fixed. Hawks got commentary. Delivery trucks received arias that bent like laughter in a storm. Paperwork acquired footnotes shaped like paw prints and tooth marks. The lexicon expanded until the edges blurred, and he realized that words could not keep up with behavior. He did not try to reclaim old efficiencies. The room learned to accept chaos like weather, preparing without complaint, yielding without surrender. He caught himself smiling at nonsense, which meant the nonsense had colonized him. The canyon appeared through the window as a patient animal, not interested in any of this, and also somehow responsible for it. By late afternoon, fatigue came flavored with an odd pleasure that felt dangerous. He knew, clinically and personally, that pleasure often leads to consequences.
he waited anyway. On the rare day when company crossed the threshold, the room transformed again into a theater with a single actor and an audience that never knew when to applaud. The sequence was dependable in its unpredictability. Leap, roll, purr like velvet engines, pause for hand licks, then a sudden serpentine hiss at something as harmless as a shoelace. Faces did the math of fear and delight simultaneously. Explanations tried to form and then evaporated because explanation required a script nobody had issued. He stayed back, letting observation do the translation. People left unsettled and smiling, puzzled by a creature that bent cuteness into dominance and dominance into charm so fast the categories blurred. After the door clicked shut, the room expanded to its normal size, and the purr reset to the domestic thunder he had learned to crave. He cleaned up confetti made from receipt paper and pride.
Days folded, and he noticed the precise moment when he stopped apologizing for her and started arranging the world to fit around her. This was not surrender, not entirely. It was architecture. He placed fragile things higher, fragile feelings lower, and allowed motion to become law. The desert outside painted patience in ochre and shadow, and the clinic mirrored it with an interior climate built from ritualized mischief. The ledger lost authority, the room gained it. He moved through spaces with an awareness of where paws would land and where eyes would judge. Humor grew feral and generous. He allowed a life he would not have approved of in any other setting, and because he allowed it, the setting sanctioned him back. The machine purr accompanied checklists and mistakes alike, smoothing edges he used to sharpen for survival. Confession became unnecessary. He was already forgiven by fur and noise. The night fractured at an hour that had no name. He woke to a silence so complete it felt predatory, a pressure instead of a gap. The room had the wrong shape without the hum that usually stitched it together. His feet found boots with the clumsy urgency of bad dreams, and the flashlight found the door with a click that sounded like a tiny betrayal. The enclosure stood too still. Shadows failed to breathe where they should have. Panic arrived in a clean line from throat to stomach. No frills, no intelligence, only velocity. Outside, the canyon rearranged wind to magnify footfall. The flashlight beam cut brush into pieces that looked like threats. Coyotes sang far off, mercifully uninterested in him. He called nothing. He kept moving. The silence held like a trap, and he offered heartbeat after heartbeat as payment.
Gravel refused to quiet under his weight. The beam jittered with every pulse he could not control, painting frantic loops across rock and scrub. The desert felt bigger than on any other night, each formation leaning inward with curiosity about human panic. He counted landmarks like prayers, found each one less reassuring than the last. Memory of screams and trills had once grated. Now he begged the dark for the insult to return. Tracks lied or told the truth without clarity, small smudges that might belong to everything or nothing. He followed hope like a rookie tracker and nearly walked into a mesquite thorn because his eyes kept asking the dark to give him a shape it would not surrender. The wind changed, and with it the scent map shifted just enough to disorient. He kept moving because stopping had too much imagination attached. The beam finally grazed a geometry that made sense. 2 points of reflected light set exactly where a porch rail becomes throne. The rest of her arrived as his breath did, in a staggered flood of relief that anger wanted to mix with and could not. The chirp that met him carried the kind of satisfaction one hears from an accomplished thief returning to a familiar fence. The purr engaged immediately, a conveyor belt of forgiveness that required him to participate. Fear was seated as if it had never existed, leaving behind the damp shirt, the scuffed shins, the awareness that routines had shifted again without his consent.
The canyon shrugged and returned to its own business. He tasted night air like medicine and found it bitter and perfect. She stretched with a comedy yawn that performed innocence as an afterthought. He unlocked the door without ceremony or lecture.
Her coat filled out and threw light back at morning with new confidence. The voice, once only chaos, now displayed a virtuosity that startled birds from juniper crowns and made delivery drivers reevaluate career paths. His rules dropped off like leaves in a wrong season, each falling with a tiny joy he pretended not to witness. Work continued, less neatly and more truly, stitched with noises that mapped the territory of affection. He was not proud of the adjustments, which made them more honest. The clinic became a choreography he did not choreograph. Scar memory in him lost relevance because the present kept insisting its case with purr and absurdity. He understood more about animals and less about control each week, which delighted and frightened him equally. The canyon outside approved without comment, providing backdrops and weather, never permission, always context. Sleep, when it came thin, a gauze that brightened at edges and billowed under every small sound. In the dream, he walked hospital corridors that smelled of bleach and loss, the squeal at the end of the hall both catastrophe and invitation. He reached for doors that would not open because they belonged to a life he had refused. The sound cut across linoleum and crawled through his ribs into waking. The room shaped itself around absence again, until the soft chirp near the threshold threaded the space together. She sat at the line between night and him, tail tucked, eyes patient, humming permission to return to the present. He breathed desert instead of disinfectant. The past released one finger from his throat. He slept again, lighter, and did not mind that a small engine anchored the dream to the floorboards.
There existed a time when he counted successes by charts balanced and procedures executed under the fluorescent's tireless buzz. Mentors wore competence like armor and fell like trees all the same, leaving silence that machines could not fill. He had fled that antiseptic world for a horizon wide enough to dilute grief, only to find that grief travels faster than trucks and learns the country roads. The canyon had accepted him, but acceptance is not anesthesia. He built a clinic small enough to hear himself think. He discovered that thinking can be the loudest noise of all. Then a voice moved in that outshouted the old archives without erasing them, harmonizing instead, forcing a duet he had not auditioned for. He resented the arrangement until he needed it. The ledger became a hymn book. The hymn book never closed because the purr underwrote every note. The night returned to the porch with more stars than reasons. Heat rose from rock in ghostly drafts and smudged the lower constellations into river light. He stretched his legs toward the steps and balanced a mug against his knee, careful of the place where a small head historically claimed territory. The desert performed its patient recital, cicadas pulsing, owl syllables drifting, wind editing branches into better sentences. He let his shoulders drop as if gravity had finally decided to offer comfort rather than punishment. The weight against him arrived on cue, heavier than memory allows, warmer than weather deserves, purr engine settling into a speed that implied a long drive with no turns. He did not seek epiphany. He glanced upward anyway. The sky looked busy enough to ignore him, and kind enough to forgive him. For once, both truths helped.
The squeal detonated in the quiet evening like a bottle rocket corkscrewing into the vault of sky. Absurd, bright, and perfectly wrong for the stillness. Laughter tore out of him before pride could edit it. Not polite, not professional, just the sound a body makes when it stops guarding old ruins. Muscles he had trained for restraint forgot their contracts. He leaned back and let hilarity burn through anxiety's scaffolding. The canyon bounced it back, less sharp, more generous, like a choir catching the melody from a hoarse soloist. He tasted salt and maybe desert grit, or maybe something more interior. The small machine beside him vibrated with its own certainty about how this should go. The laugh softened at the edges until it became breath, and the breath settled into rhythm with the purr. He understood that the architecture of his defenses had finally failed. The night held the echo of laughter and refused to weaponize it. The porch boards cooled. The canyon agreed to be immense without being indifferent. The small body pressed closer, choosing contact like a position worth defending. He ran a hand along fur that no longer looked like a map of old neglect, but like proof that persistence sometimes wins arguments with damage. The machine hum under his palm felt endless, not as a threat, but as a promise that endurance can be tender. He assembled names for the moment and discarded them for being too clever. He offered gratitude to a landscape that would never hear it and to a creature that already understood it. The horizon darkened to velvet. The crickets found their pulse again. The world did not grow quieter. It became the right kind of loud. He stayed still and let it remake him.